Hello, I'm Susan Williams. I'm the National Education Coordinator for the Freedom Socialist Party, and I'm a retired physician living in New York. I wanted to talk tonight about the connection between the viral pandemic and the economic crash that's circulating the globe right now. It's important to realize that the pandemic did not cause the economic crisis. It triggered it. But what it triggered was the built-in mechanisms within capitalism that guarantee that there will be recurrent crises in the system and inevitably recessions. I'd refer people, if you'd like to read more about our analysis of this, to look at the February-March edition of the Freedom Socialist newspaper. It's available at socialism.com. And we have an article there called The Pivotal 2020s, A Time for Revolutionary Ideas. And there, in a paper that I co-authored, we talk about not only why it is that capitalism will inevitably have these kind of horrendous downturns and crash after crash, but also what was specifically going on in the year 2019 that made it inevitable that, in fact, there would be a crisis sooner than later, and this time it would be a really horrendous one. To summarize briefly, one of the faults that's built into capitalism as a system is that it is essentially a chaotic way of organizing production. As technology improves, it's possible to make more and more goods, more commodities more quickly and with less labor time put into each one. There's a drive, because all these different businesses are in competition with one another, for each to rev up production as much as possible, to pay their workers as little as possible, and get their goods to market, flood the markets with them. But the problem is that nobody knows in this kind of system whether an item is really needed, whether it can be distributed until it gets to the marketplace. And then the question is, not only is it something that people need and want, but will they be able to afford it? Inevitably, we get to a system where, in fact, they can't sell all their goods. Corporations which have borrowed money in order to expand their businesses then crash. They lay off workers massively, who then can buy even fewer of the commodities that are being produced. And the cycle continues until they find some way to rev up business again, either through war, which has been a recurrent issue and part of capitalism in the past, or through the kind of massive bailouts and transfer of public funds into the private sector that we saw after the 2008 recession. Now, even as we're going through this cycle and many small businesses are being crushed and workers are being impoverished, there is a top layer of capitalists that make out like bandits. And that's happening this time around too. The point I really want to underscore here is that a particular event like the current pandemic sets the spark. It sets off the explosion, but the bomb and the fuse were already there, waiting for a disaster to happen. I'd also like to point out that there's a real distinction. When you listen to news about the economy, we were getting all sorts of mixed messages in the past and certainly in February about how booming, how great the stock market is doing. Last year was supposed to be such a terrific year. But the fact is that the stock market really represents what has to be called fictitious capital. This is a term from Marxism that means that it's all built on smoke and mirrors. It's almost not at all based on real material wealth, on things that people actually need and use. There's a tremendous sector in the financial sector in this period of capitalism's development that is purely based on speculation and on betting whether the systems are going to go up or down. And that's one reason the stock market can be so volatile from day to day. Then there's the real economy, the real production of goods and services that we need in our everyday lives. The picture last year that we were being told was rosy about that too. Economy is doing great. We kept revising the figures upwards. So few people are officially on the unemployment stats. But a more careful look at what was going on in the world last year showed a really different picture. In fact, the gross domestic product, which is a way that systems measure the total amount of goods and services that are available and that are being produced for people, was going down worldwide over the last several years. It had stalled completely in many countries like Japan, which essentially had a zero growth rate. It was slowing down even in the Chinese tiger economy that was one of the main factors that pulled the world out of the 2008 recession. And many countries were actually going in a negative direction through tremendous hardship of the people that live there. Argentina, Venezuela, Greece, and of course, war-torn countries like Syria were just complete disaster zones. So again, the point I'm underscoring here is that however rosy the stock market might have looked and other figures that they tell us in the nightly news shows, the reality of what the world was actually able to make and produce was slowing down in its rate of growth. And that spells out a danger for capitalism. Something else too that's very important is that we've been told a lot, especially in the United States, about this marvelous recovery that the economy has made since 2008. But the fact of the matter is that that wasn't the case. And a lot of us here in this country know it from our own experiences. We or our relatives or our friends never got back the jobs we had, never lost our houses and weren't able to replace that, lost our savings, our retirement funds. And it was, of course, the people who were already poorest, people of color, people who had been able to get only part-time jobs, the majority of women and people of color who work in the public sector. All of these people were not making up all the ground that was lost after 2008, no matter how well the big corporations were doing. And in other countries, the situation also was starkly different than it was here. The poorest nations of the world never recovered from 2008 to the degree, for example, that this country did. And these are countries in which there is no safety net for the pandemic now. Not only in terms of the health catastrophe, we're talking about countries where there is food insecurity, where people have a high rate of being homeless, where there may be little or no access to clean water. These countries and these people also that are already ravaged by disease, such as the 24 million or so people in the continent of Africa who have AIDS already and are compromised for that reason, or people that are crowded into refugee camps. The viral crisis is going to hit these countries particularly hard. And the economic blow is also going to be multiplied. Here in the United States, the hit to working people, and as with those in other advanced capitalist countries, was still quite severe. And we have not totally recovered from years of austerity, from wage suppression. But for the billions in the developing countries, the economic crisis that's coming will be even more devastating. I want to share a few images and graphs with you that I hope will help understand this. First, on the issue of what's happening in developing nations. I'm going to convert this to slideshow form here. Okay. One of the points I was making is that many of the poorer nations, what's usually called in capitalist parlance as emerging economies, had not recovered in at all the same rate or way that the wealthier nations did. For example, since 2010, what we see here is that the debt that these countries have acquired has been steadily going up and up and up until for almost all of them, it is nearing twice as much as their actual gross domestic product. So the hope of them ever being able to pay it off and get out of debt, escape from those costs, is minimal unless something radically changes in the system itself. And meanwhile, the growth in these countries has steadily declined, even during the so-called years of recovery. So many of these nations around the world are in very poor shape to be facing another crisis. This gives an example in graphic form of exactly what happens too and how these countries become so much more susceptible. normally there's a certain rate at which there's investment capital in which money is moving into these poor nations. But whenever there's an economic crisis, that drops sharply. They're among the first to suffer. This graph, the blue line here, shows what happened in the global financial crisis that hit in 2008. And you can see over the subsequent months, the amount of net flow of investment into these nations dropped and it became negative. So they were paying out more than they were having coming in. Similar thing happened when the Chinese stock market crashed just for a few months in August of 2015. And you can see the effect here. But this red line, this is what's happened just in the first couple of months since the viral pandemic was really declared, starting with the start date of January 21st and extending for an almost 2-month period. And you can see already the sharp decline in the flow of monies into these countries has really bottomed out. And at the same time, they have been expending a net amount of over $50 billion in expenses and trying to get goods for their own countries. The situation is quite dire. In the meantime, how are the American businesses and the big international corporations doing? Well, I wanted to use the airlines as an example because, of course, they were the first to get in line and start insisting that they needed to have a massive bailout. And the question is, they've been making massive profits. We've heard for the last several years that these were record years for these companies. And yet now, within 2 months of the crisis hitting, they are saying there's no money. Well, what happened to it? There's a certain amount of what's called free cash flow. This is the amount of excess money that a company has at any given time. And then when they're taken out of the business, it counts as profits. So cash flow is the live action profits, so the amount that are taken out over the year. And in the period of the last 5 years, what have the 5 big airlines collectively done? Well, they could have taken that excess cash flow and put it into things like wage and benefits increases, into new and updated equipment, safer equipment. They could have spent more money trying to figure out how to reduce the environmental impact of airplane flight. And the final thing that they did, and what in fact they mostly did with the pittance they did put this direction, was to put it into cash reserve. In other words, save it for the rainy day or the day when people had to stop flying for a period of time. But over the last 5 years, only 4% of airlines' free cash flow has actually gone into their reserves. Meanwhile, 96% of their free cash flow has gone to enrich the owners. And dividends, which have gone steadily up, not only for the airline industry, but ever since the onset of neoliberalism, major companies have been taking out more and more of their profits to just give to the stockholders outright. That's bad enough. But even worse is the fact that they have used a lot of that money for stock buybacks. What does that mean? It means any extra money they have lying around, and extra means things that, of course, they're taking away from their workers and that they're taking away from their customers. That money they use to buy back their own stock whenever it's on the market. That artificially inflates the value of their stock, driving prices up. And for the people who own stock, it's a way to make capital gains, which are then they pay less on taxes than if they were given the money outright as dividends. So tax cheats are artificially jacking up the value of their stock in order to make more money. And again, 96% of that free cash flow has actually gone into exactly that. This gives a picture of why it is that capitalism as an economic and social system is incapable of dealing with the kind of social and health challenge that we're presented with now. Why does this happen? Why did they take all this money and use it for the things that I've outlined here? Was it because they're greedy and evil? Well, they are greedy and evil, and that's part of their job description, but that's not why. The why is that they have to do that in order to remain competitive with other airlines. Capitalism has a logic of its own. And that money has to be, it has to continually expand, and they have to continually plow it into ways to be profitable and to be competitive, or they die. That is completely at odds. And the crisis that we're going through now just shows how profoundly it is at odds with the rational needs of society and social good. So this is how the capitalist system essentially looks at crises like the coronavirus. Well, at least we're ready for the coronavirus, where they have their containers of toxic politics ready to go. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we're starting to see now. I want to give an example to try and present graphically what can happen at a nexus like this when we're presented with a crisis in an already polarized society, and we have options now about which way we're going to go. The capitalist system, its defining law is to prioritize profit over everything else. And we've already seen what that leads to. Immediately obvious, the kind of scarcity and hoarding on the part of the government, even with its secret mega stores of supplies that people actually vitally need now, price gouging, and even more to the point, incredible profiteering through bailouts and speculation. What have we seen since the bailout package was, even before it was actually passed? We saw big corporations send their lobbyists to start lining up at the trough to get as big a chunk of that money as possible. But not only through the bailouts themselves, but folks that operate hedge funds that bet on the system to fail are making billions of dollars. They have made billions of dollars already, even as businesses and individuals are collapsing and being brought down by the economic disaster. There are folks that are growing very, very much wealthier over exactly the same problem. And again, inherent within the system. But if there's a need, an obvious necessity to change how we approach that, the system really has two options, and one is to go to the right. What would we see here if our system takes that kind of direction? And what President Trump has already talked about doing gives some indication of that. Again, to maintain capitalism, the primary goal is going to be to protect big business and to protect their stranglehold on state power. There may well be efforts to expand the centralized government authority. The word I have written down here, Bonapartism, what that means is a phenomenon that we've seen actually growing in this country for decades. Traces of it even as back far as the Korean War, but one that Trump has really exacerbated tremendously. What it means is the government looking for a potential strongman, somebody who claims to be representing the people, who portrays himself as above the fray of contending classes, but truly is operating and using that power in the interests of business. Bonapartist strongman government can in fact bring with it a risk of fascism. It can be a bridge to that if it's allowed to grow and not confronted by a massive public movement. In the system where the right wing becomes stronger and the government becomes more authoritarian, the elite will be determining the allocation of resources. And we will see, again, on an even greater level than in 2008, a massive transfer of public wealth to the private sector. At this point, there's definitely a tension going on around this. People have heard about the Defense Production Act, which allows the president to tell businesses what to produce in order to get more of the goods that are really needed. And under pressure, Trump said that this, in fact, was being activated, but it hasn't been used yet. Both he and, for example, Governor Cuomo of New York are relying instead on the carrot approach, onto cajoling and bribing and paying higher prices to companies to make the goods that are so desperately needed and will be far more needed in the few weeks ahead. At the same time, one of the dangers of this is that business really doesn't want to lose their control over this. They're caught in the question of how much are they going to allow the centralized government, the executive branch in particular, to accrue even more and more power and control, and how much of that power over their own interests are they going to allow the government to take over. That's part of the tension that's going on within the ruling class that we need to be aware of and to watch. But heading toward the right and a more centralized and authoritarian and big brother type government is not the only option that we have here. In fact, it's entirely possible to push the country to the left. And in a society that was definitely undertaking a socialist transformation, the primary goal would be the well-being of humanity and of the earth. The kind of chaos that we have now of never producing enough of what really people really need, even while we're glutted with other products that are created on their presumed susceptibility. Instead of having that chaos, we would be able to have centralized planning, collective planning of what it was most important to produce and to make, and where it should be made, and how it should be distributed. And that distribution would be based on need and on a collective democratic decision-making process that would involve the producers themselves, the folks on the ground who really know how things operate and what's really needed. And priorities would be, again, collectively agreed on, which would include protecting the earth and also include prevention and preparedness, being able to, this was, let's face it, seen coming down the pike. The military, the government had all sorts of models and dry runs predicting what would happen. And yet, because preparations wouldn't be profitable or popular, they simply didn't do them. A society in which we, the vast majority of the population who are affected by these things, could collectively evaluate that and make decisions, would have very different priorities. And how do we get to that kind of revolutionary change of society? Well, we can use a concept called transitional demands, which is something that was raised within the Trotskyist movement. It's talked about in the transitional program, which is a pamphlet also known as the Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International. This is something that revolutionaries today, I think, really need to very consciously study and think about how to apply to our current period. The concept is to take the things that we so obviously need to change in terms of what needs to be provided to people, how decisions need to be made, what kind of things need to be prioritized in the society, how we need to protect workers, and to link the fight for getting those reforms, getting those changes now, as much of them as we can, with making a connection to and a bridge to a genuinely revolutionary movement, using it as a moment in which people can see and visualize what a real transformation of society could mean and what it would take. These demands that are listed here are an example of the initial slogans and calls that were put out by the Freedom Socialist Party in our first response to the coronavirus pandemic. It also will appear, as well as very frequent updates and additional news and ideas about how to fight back, on our website, socialism.com. But these are all things that are geared to addressing what is so glaringly obvious in terms of what's needed, or what would be a better way to run things, a more rational way to organize things, and also help people see and understand what it would mean to really change the society in a completely revolutionary manner, and has a sense of our power to do that. Just as one example, the first that's listed here, a universal healthcare system. Many people now are talking about expanding Medicare to cover all people. But actually, a great deal more than that is needed. We need to make sure that it's universal, that it's completely free, that it's not tied to profiteering and profit making in any form, that it doesn't rely, in other words, on funneling money into the private sector in order to function. We need to nationalize the medical industry, including and especially the pharmaceuticals. And it should be managed by those of us who have been healthcare workers and who are patients, who are consumers of healthcare. In that kind of system, it would be so much easier, so much more rational to organize the kind of response to the pandemic than we're seeing happen now, the flailing around, the craziness, the having people from 6,000 different hospitals and tens of thousands of doctors' offices and clinics all across the country, all scrambling and making phone calls trying to find masks. And also, by the way, tens of thousands of people learning how to stitch them up at home and donate them to their local hospitals. Instead of that kind of chaos, we could have a plan system. We could have computer links all over the world that would help us assess what was needed and where, and could do that kind of planning. I mentioned the airlines earlier. They're on my personal list for the next guys to nationalize for sure. If businesses can't, it's not even a matter of can't be trusted to run themselves rationally and to be able to respond to crises like this, because again, it's part and parcel of the system, but it shows how desperately we need to nationalize transportation and energy production under control by working people, by the vast majority of us, in order to have a sensibly run system. And I will just mention two other things. There are many things that are listed here. There are other demands that are being evolved and things that many different people are working on. But again, we have to do whatever is necessary to protect all working people in this country. Let's face it, the planned $2 trillion fund, which is going to end up costing a lot more, is going to do, I will say nothing because I can't really think of any way it will reach, but undocumented workers, the vast majority of gig workers or part-time workers, anybody who's struggling to get by in the informal economy by working off the books. There are a tremendous number of people that it's not going to help. The homeless certainly can't be supported through this kind of epidemic if they're still living out on the streets or in crowded shelters. So again, there's many things that we need to do, and we need to focus this on the people who are most harshly and stringently affected, not only in this country, but in the nations worldwide who are least able to deal with this crisis. And we need to be constantly aware of that and holding the line against the kind of racist scapegoating that has gone on in this part and parcel of Trump politics, as well as, again, the potential risk for developing fascism as well. And with that, I just want to say that this is a challenging time, but it's a time when people need more than ever to be hearing a clear message about revolutionary politics and the fact that socialism really is a logical, doable, and much better alternative for humanity. I think people are ready for this message and need this message more than ever before. So it's really important that we are right in the front lines of the battle to save the society now. And again, I refer people for more updates and for virtual meetings and other activities that you can participate in at socialism.com. Thanks very much.